in this event discussing the work of Salon architecture and also understanding that the proceeds from this event will go towards the humanitarian effort in Turkey and Syria. A catastrophe that we understand is very much due, as Alper mentioned, to buildings not being constructed to compliance with earthquakes. So, I think there's a sense of responsibility that the discipline feels quite strongly. What I wanted to touch on in my talk that will really be very quick about surfaces is these kind of earthly chronologies and relationships of architecture to uncertain grounds. They form part of the narrative of Geospaces. And the work provokes certain thoughts about the relationship of these surfaces to the troubles with which we should stay. And so the book, as Alper describes, the title Geospaces comes from Haraway's Geostories and her text particularly staying with the troubles. So that is a trouble we will stay with. Geospaces emerges from a post-Anthropocene moment, one of taking stock of the fragility of human life and proposing continuities with planetary time. The work of Salon architecture is presented in a timeline, so this is actually at the back of the book, but the timeline insists on relationality in relation to Earth and its movement, so we see Marmara, in relation to texts, the text Earth Moves, in relation to falling walls, the Wall of Berlin. And the timeline also sets the work in relation to architects that have been suspect of level surfaces. So we see Claude Parent's fonction oblique mentioned. The oblique function inscribed the effort of living on a non-horizontal with a kind of resistance. And so the oblique function called for this physical engagement, a very dynamic relation with the ground. So this particular timeline inscribes architecture in a similarly dynamic relation to the Earth, emphasizing how young architecture is in the scheme of planetary time. Planetary time, as Alper showed us in the diagram, makes of this an unusual drawing for architecture. This chronology that he has unfolded for us indicates the very sliver of human existence in context of the ancestral time of the Earth. And we know that this concept of ancestral time provoked a speculation on realism in Meillassoux, Harman's, and others present at the workshop at Goldsmiths in the UK, the founding moment of speculative realism, and this could be another dot added to the timeline, marking 2007 as a moment that thinks entities in relation to other entities, a moment that views living as a function of entanglement, to use a current formulation of planetary interdependency. And this, I was intrigued by this drawing because it resembles a phylogenetic tree, a diagram used to describe relations between living entities over time. On the left, you see the relations between 2.3 million species. The dark lines indicate those for whom we have genetically sequenced information. The lighter lines represent all of those that we don't. On the right, you see another phylogenetic tree of the over 9,000 living bird species, and again, the relations over millennia. And millennia are inscribed in the thinking of this book, which begins with the earliest human architectures. Caves appear several times throughout this book, signifying a contemporary architecture that is thinking, engaging, and possibly wrestling with its relationship to the ground, a relation that ties architecture to the carbon-intensive extraction of elements from the ground, to the transportation of globalized construction materials across the ground, and to the demolition of what exists in order to pave new ground for building. So this is an architecture that is thinking its relation to planetary anthropogenic forces in considering this kind of vernacular efficiency of the cave as a starting point. The cave. It's an adaptation of a geological formation, but it's also a prompt for shared inhabitation, human and non-human. The adaptation of natural forms registers for, and these dovecots date from some 300 years ago, this moment where humans decide to carve dwellings for other species, the cliff-dwelling rock doves, that can be really companions in agriculture. And it helps us mark these buildings that root in the ground rather than accommodate the ranging of hunter-gathering. Living spaces that are carved into found or existing materials brings us into a dialogue with the vernacular, a building approach that is local or regional, using resources from an area where the building is located. And consequently, this is an architecture that is closely related to its context. The vernacular architecture of Cappadocia, for example, adapts the soft tufa rock, the residue from volcanic eruptions, and to make homes, barns, sacred spaces, makes the ground this kind of indigenous material. So tufa registers climate and tectonic forces, as well as the cultural and social dimensions of the region. And I want to relate that to some of the work that Alper has shown. This attunement of materiality of the site seems to emerge in a number of Salon's works. I'll just focus on one, the Quarry Museum, which deploys the wood shingle to create this kind of linked structure that ties the materiality of the park and the tree with this wood shingle facade to the color and possibly the elementality, the clay of the brick, to the buildings, to the neighboring buildings. With the surface treatment, this project seems to critique the modernist separation of nature from human society, set forth so powerfully in the late Bruno Latour's work, We Have Never Been Modern. But Quarry also recalls to us more vernacular formats, the vernacular of Western architectural history, which signal the critique of the globalizing tendencies of late modern architecture. For example, with Venturi Scott Brown's Nantucket houses of the early 70s, and these material intelligences of the vernacular coinciding with the emergence of environmentalist discourses. And we could think as well to Rodofsky's 1964 exhibition and book that brought the buildings and techniques then disregarded by many to the attention of the architectural mainstream. You see right here, like some of the structures we've seen from Turkey, the Sicilian hillside suggests what Alper has described in the book, this kind of iterative adaptation of the ground from geological formation to a burial ground to what became medieval dwellings. So this adaptation of the earth to which Salon architecture refers connects contemporary architecture with these vernacular approaches and contrasts, I think very importantly, to the high environmental cost of the surfaces that characterize modernity, the glass, concrete, and steel, as well as the extractive economies used to generate these materials. The surfaces of Quarry recall the vernacular intelligence of locality, salvage, site specificity, and material economy. That Salon titles this image in particular in the book, A Habitat Facade, signals a desire for architecture to connect living entities. And this work this is another shingle-clad structure by Jason Payne, Raspberry Fields. I did not know at the time that Jason was actually Alper's instructor, but I must have sensed a kind of kinship in the work and a kind of dialogue between the works. So this, the vitality of this cladding reminds us lies in the ability of the cladding to translate and register humidity and atmosphere, curling and weathering, But this dynamic could equally refer to, at a different scale, the registration of atmospheric effects that we find in Salon's Fitas passage, for example. My final thoughts have to do with this connection, the set of connections to which the book refers, the constant modification of a space that stages architecture. But this process of dynamic connection to the planetary crust, we should remember, is not exclusive to the human species. Inhabitation is opportunistic, dynamic, adaptive in the best of cases among many species. So we return to birds again. A habitat facade then might have scope for numerous connections to the entities we lump together as animals or as nature. Can architecture as a habitat, an architecture whose facade signals habitation, develop material intelligence in its manifold dimensions, economy, locality, ecological consciousness, to bring multiple scales of existence into human ethical regard? And does this question, architecture as an iteration of nature, point us to the techno-natures, the sub-natures, the post-natures described in many of my favorite authors in grappling with the status of architecture in an environment that registers so deeply the catastrophic excavations, extractions spurred by the modern ethos? And Geospaces is a text that asks us to question these relations at a planetary scale. Thank you.
Okay. I'm Michael Young. Good to see everybody tonight. Congratulations to Alper. The book looks fantastic. The work is wonderful to see, and I'm super happy to be here. I'm going to do something a little bit different. I'm going to tell a bunch of stories. We got the spaces that are geo, the spaces of the earth, and I'm thinking, what about the ground? So let's maybe take a few minutes to think about the ground and all the ways in which we talk about the ground in our daily life. If you say somebody's grounded, they're solid, they're calm, they're somehow stable in the ways in which they think about the world and how they express themselves. We also use ground as a way in which to think through precedent in a legal manner. What are the grounds for what you say? What is it based on? What are the things that come before it that provide the context that allows you to provide the argument that you want to do? We ground our electricity, somehow the infinite ability for the Earth to gather and hold the electrons that we send through our walls in the invisible interiors of our pochets. We even grind our meat and our spices, and we grind ourselves down in the ways in which we ever for the daily grind of the ways in which we have to live in the world become morsels of ourselves in one manner or another. And all of us at one moment in time, we probably had the experience where we did something that wasn't exactly what our parents wanted us to do, and they told us, you're grounded. And I thought about that, because like, hell, it's not like I live in some kind of manor house, and I have to be held within the grounds of that confine, yet that is actually what it's talking about. The household, that which is held, the Latin translation of domus is a household, which is also the roots of our words like domestic, domicile, domain, dominion, domination. And there's something in this sort of what is held within the grounds, what is held within the grounds that we begin to establish as the locale of a way in which an architecture builds a site, and that site in its social relations, and that site in the ways in which we understand its ability to have a control over the nature that is its ground, how it is kept. Think about the ways in which something has to get manicured. The cutting, the trimming, the hedging, the raking, the watering, the mowing, the labor that goes into manicuring a ground and so it can never be perceivably aesthetically changed. To be there for the pleasure of the onlooker, for the pleasure of the person whose ownership is of that property, the lord of the land or the landlord. And when I think of who does the ground keeping, I think of one groundskeeper in mind. And for me, it's this. Like when I think of the groundskeeper, I think of Carl. It's just what it is, and all of his struggles with the ground, all of the problems he has with that which is living in the ground, the species that are trying to frustrate his desire to manicure and keep that ground tight and needy and pleasant for those who are the golfers that are using it for the pleasure of their leisure activity. But of course, that ground that is being kept comes from a very British source, and it comes from the manor house, the groundskeepers of the ways in which the land about the house was viewed as an extension of the profit that that house was able to produce. So the way that the ground is organized both spatially and temporally into a series of fields that would be worked by the people who had specific plots of lands that were then being used to supply a translation of the mineralogy of the ground through the plant life that would grow on it into the nutrition that we then consume in our bodies. And that whole transformation ultimately as an economic model for a way in which we view the exploitation of that which has been provided by the earth. There's a number of things that kind of flow through here which have religious origins, things like provenance, things that have been provided for us to make good on. Extremely problematic, and yet running through so many of the ways in which we understand that which is the organization of property, the organization of the estate that happens to be in this manner real, as opposed to the estate that is on one's person, the items and objects that one owns. In that negotiation of the real estate, the negotiation of the labor in the real estate, the negotiation of those who are working could also then be used as a kind of trade. If you had a debt somewhere else, you could commute that labor to another person, and those people who did so were our first commuters. And for those of us who don't happen to live on the land that we work on, we're all commuters. The ways in which land is surveyed, the drawings that we have in our drawing sets, the one drawing that is required for any permit set is that site plan. And that site plan, which measures out and parcels out the plot and organizes for its divisions of property, is there where those conflicts are negotiated. And at its root, there's also this desire to measure the land through physical objects, the surveyor's chains, these chains that would be carried and literally stretched across the ground and over objects to have a material, physical presence to the ways in which something could be agreed upon or disagreed upon. How we survey, how we measure the land has gone through several transformations. The one that was imported here first from the colonies is from England and from Europe, the meets and bounds method, which looked at features in the landscape, trees, rocks, hills, mountains, creeks, bridges, to begin to measure out and bound and bind that land into an organization that could then be demarcated through geometry, the measure of the earth. Here is surveyed by a 17-year-old future president, but somebody trained initially in surveying in the state of Virginia. All of that changes in terms of the ways in which the United States is demarcated and organized in terms of its ground organizations, and that changes in 1785 with a land ordinance that we now know as the Jeffersonian grid. That grid, which is organized north-south, organized around meridians, organized as a kind of parcel that could be sold without being seen, that could be used as a speculation for agrarian life, that could then provoke somebody to move through a gap in the Appalachians to cultivate a land that they had not ever been to. That is why our western New York looks different than our eastern New York in terms of counties, in terms of the ways in which the land is subdivided. That is why Iowa looks the way Iowa does in terms of its subdivision. And this is a political act of organizing our relationship to the ground that begins to then set up townships, that then begins to set up economies, that then begins to set up the appearance of the landscape and the ways in which we understand its presence for our occupation as humans. There's a violent history here in the ways in which we think about surveying. Surveying as the triangulation of measurements of distance through the projection of a line of sight, triangulated and then measured through two images of a single point in space, but also the triangulation to measure where and in which ways the projectiles of warfare would be launched into that space. The triangulation and the measurements of colonization, the triangulations and the measurements to map a country which is not the country of which the people who are indigenous or who had lived there throughout millennia, but one that allowed that map to then be taken back to another country, to another economy, to another mode of occupation, and used for the expansion of its needs. And if you so happen to be directing the mapping of India, you get to name a mountain after yourself. This is also the history of photogrammetry. Photogrammetry, the ways in which we are now currently surveilling ourselves, surveilling our cities, surveilling our Earth, is a mapping of a point in space measured and calculated by two images of that point in space, held in projections triangulated to determine its distance and depth. This is old. This is the origins of geometry. This is the ways in which the small triangle tells us about the big triangle, the ways in which projections flatten out to the flat plane of the shadow, the ways in which I can measure a little thing to begin to have impact on a larger thing, the drawings that we use as architects. And it is also there in the plane geometry of Euclid, the geometry, the measure of the Earth treated as one abstraction that can be calculated through the construction of variable areas. This is a squared plus b squared equals c squared. And it's a proof that is done through geometry prior to that of number. And once the land, the earth, the ground can be abstracted to a plane, architecture begins to be thought through differently. The Maison Domino, which is a play on Domus, the Roman house, was not only a concrete construction patent, it was a reconceptualization of the repetition, the domino stacking repetition of what is the earth. The ground can go up. It can become stacked again and again. And the Downtown Athletic Club, most famously used by Rem Koolhaas in his arguments in Delirious, New York, is a reproduction of the city, a reproduction of its rent, a reproduction of its ground, echoed up through the skyscraper, made available to us through the modern technologies of the elevator, the HVAC system, and the steel construction frame. Every architecture actually tells a story about a ground, about a way in which they consider their architecture to build a new ground, the ground that can flow through and under the building and then be reproduced on its roof, the ground that tumbles down as a stepped terracing, a mound in which the buildings huddle around. A ground, as Ariane said and as Alper references, that functions obliquely, that disturbs our sense of gravity, disturbs the ways in which we move and the ways in which we occupy space. A ground that seeks to tie the city street through the building up as a continuous movement of a ramp, and bind that which is interior, that which is to that which is exterior, that which is public to that which is private. A ground that wants to nestle, retain, and use the infrastructural systems of the highways to hold into the earth a moment of memorial for the cemeteries that Marias and Pinos did. Or a ground that actually is a roof, but a roof that acts as a ground in terms of the gravity and its pressures that it puts on to us as we occupy a geospace, a space that is hovering somewhere in the thickness of a ground. And even the Villa Rotunda, in the Rotunda in the Villa Savoie is a comparison that Alper showed in relationship to his Villa Topos. The Villa Rotunda builds its own new ground, a ground that we may condemn now for having ignorance about the ways in which the landscape is around it in terms of its integration to the architecture, a ground that holds the building, that holds the architecture as an independent object or element on top of it. But it is a ground, nonetheless. The terracing, the plinth, is an organization that planarily situates views out and across the landscape. And it's one that hasn't ever gone away. The Neue National Gallery is a building on a plinth, and it is in that plinth where the building gets busy. That's where the galleries are, that which is occupying that space, which is the infrastructural heart of something like a city. Grand Central Terminal may be a hall above, but below is the Grand Central. That is where the action is on. And I can tell you, I found this, and I do not know Michelle Young. She is not me, alter ego or other names. She's not my compatriot, but she has been down into the sub-basements. And anyone who has walked along the city streets of New York long enough has seen moments like this and wondered, how the hell is this city still operating? Because this is what's in our streets, and what's in our streets is a kind of madness. It's a kind of intensity of infrastructure that has been built and accumulated century after century, building off of each other, tying to new technologies, to old technologies, and still yet bringing us things that we turn our spigot, we turn our faucet, and we wash ourselves in the morning. And these kinds of occupations of the ground with that which is what we usually do not see, consider it outside of our realm of sensation, the infrastructure that allows us to function and allows us to think of architecture as a superstructure. But without that infrastructure, the superstructure doesn't work. And the water supply to New York, I think many New Yorkers know these stories pretty well, but it's still fascinating to me that it is essentially a datum of water to a reservoir that allows us to turn on our faucets and get the water in our spigots, in our bathtubs, in our tea kettles. And if not, you need a water tower. And so there's a datum, there's a ground, there's a ways in which that infrastructure that we see and think of as below us is not actually really that all the time below us, but is also within the walls, and is also then above us in the water towers that pressure down below. Just another diagram about this system, because it is kind of like an insane system. You realize that the Catskill Aqueduct goes down 1,100 feet underground to go under the Hudson River, all done through the pressure of gravity. And those tiered reservoirs, each one tearing down to pressure up the next one, tearing down to pressure up the next one, tearing down to pressure up the next one, tearing down for me to have a drink of water. And that system of water is another way to think about what is the ground, because the New York City Water Department actually owns a huge chunk of the Catskills, a huge chunk of the watershed. Our city is not just the city that is the one that we map and we walk around daily. Our city expands and is expanded out into the landscape, and those grounds as basins that capture and shed water is what is then pulled through the aqueducts of the infrastructures that then come down to New York City. So a ground understood through a hydrology, a ground understood through a geology. The Adirondacks are radically different than the Catskills. And that gap in topography, that is the only gap in the Appalachians from Georgia until Maine, happens to be the one place where the Mohawk River divides this ground, divides these mountains, divides this place to create what was the Erie Canal and its functioning. And the Erie Canal as a building that is 363 miles long, as a building that produced the cities of Buffalo, Rochester, Syracuse, Utica, Schenectady, Troy, Albany, as a construction that produced New York City. Because it is DeWitt Clinton who was the mayor of New York, and then DeWitt Clinton who was the governor of New York, then DeWitt Clinton who was the head of the Erie Canal, who was sponsoring this through the speculation of what would happen if you could suck the minerals, the timber, the furs, the products of the middle of the country from the Great Lakes, and distribute them through New York. No longer would Philadelphia and Boston be so cool, because all of a sudden now New York City was the hub through which all material moved, and the Erie Canal was the hub through which Western expansion and its problems of manifest destiny dumped into the center of the country. The Erie Canal is a building. It is 363 miles long. It is a building on the scale of a technological sublime. And it is here that aesthetics begin to become an interesting question for us to consider as architects. Because the aesthetics of the sublime, the aesthetics of that which is sensations that can no longer perfectly make sense, or sensations that begin to inspire attention or an awe or a potential fear of the ways in which we relate to nature, and the myths that come from building up nature as a powerful force beyond our possibilities that we then tame through pastoral, agrarian means, until all of it, all ground is all architecture, and then our follies as we destroy ourselves and destroy that architecture until it returns to this moment of reclamation by the natural world. Now, I don't think we can let ourselves off so easily, because there's something in this narrative which we may see as something that is maybe in our past 150 years ago with the Hudson Valley River School and their transformation of the European sublime. But it's not actually that far away from what many people consider to be our near futures. And many people consider in that near future a kind of solace that our actions will be overtaken by a nature to come. If that is the case, then what are we to do? What is our action to be today if our actions are meaningless in this larger network of overcoming and overwhelming natural forces? And so as we map and as we model our grounds through technologies such as photogrammetry, and those scans that are revealing to us our Earth through imagery, through modeling, through a aggregation of discrete elements that have been ground down to the bit, and that bit of reflected energy is allowing us to then potentially build up new understandings of a ground through its heat, through its moisture, through its radiation, through energies that are beyond the visible spectrum, to understand when and where and how that ground begins to perform in unstable manners, when and where and how that ground begins to perform in ways that are beyond our senses. ways in which we can begin to start to see the world as maybe not as vacant as possibly assumed, but as something that is alive, in a very strange and potentially enchanted manner. This is an image that gives me some kind of hope within this potentially slightly depressing little thought about the ground. And this is an image from a thesis student of mine at Cooper, where he looked at photogrammetry scans of sites of desolation of waste, sites of the wastelands of things like former detonated atomic bombs in New Mexico. And at other spectrums, there was life forms coming back and inhabiting them with another energetic spectrum, another relationship to moisture, another relationship to the ground. And if we can begin to sense the world in ways that are outside of how we determine what our senses should be done, we can begin to hopefully make sense for a path for architecture to deal with grounds in new manners in the future. Thank you.
Boy, I hate following Michael Young, but what can I do? Thank you, Alper, for including me in your event. Congratulations on your book. Looks amazing. And Alper actually said, I don't want a regular book launch. I want you guys to actually also show some of your work or what you're interested in the larger context of geospace. And I think that's really a beautiful idea. And I was thinking to myself, okay, what could that be? And I'll get to that in a minute, but being from Turkey as well, just like Alper, I feel very much impacted by the earthquake as well. So I preface my presentation also with this image, which is a geospace of a particular kind. It's the fault that actually came to the surface during the earthquake in Turkey and Syria, and it's, I think, 400 kilometers long, and it looks almost benign. It even sort of, went under the road, like not even touching it. But we all know the actual destruction it caused. I think the last numbers of casualties stand at 40,000, and they will certainly go up. So what I want to quickly talk about is a couple of research studios I've been teaching. I'm an associate professor at the University of Pennsylvania Weitzman School of Design. And the two last research studios that I taught were in Cappadocia. You have already seen a number of references today about Cappadocia. So when we think about rock and rock habitation and rock dwellings, Cappadocia is a good place to start and perhaps even to end. And so what I'd like to show you today, it's almost like a stream of conscience in regard to some of the particularities of the site and then bits and pieces of projects. You won't really see any architectural projects. What you will see are speculative material engagements with an architecture that may arise in Cappadocia following a long tradition of architectural rock habitation. This is the location of Cappadocia. For those of you who are not very familiar with the region, just actually a little bit below that red dot is also the earthquake zone. It's a very diverse geography, geology, which is the result of 3 different volcanoes who have erupted millions of years ago in some kind of sequence that began to sort of give this very particular strata to the location, which then over time, through erosion, both wind and water, has started to formulate all kinds of extremely bizarre geological formations. And then into these geological formations, people started to carve habitations. So the tuff, that's the material, the volcanic ash that hardened over time, is very soft. You can actually carve into it with hand tools relatively easily. So there's something very visceral about it. There's something very immediate and vis-a-vis about thinking about architecture in a condition like this. I was really, it was very interesting to listen to Michael and you show all the kind of surveillance technologies, the gridding of the ground, the kind of, the way how we think about the ground through a certain set of tools. When it comes to Cappadocia, it seems a very different kind of equation. One where you don't have those tools at all. And it's a place where the architecture literally happened in a very immediate fashion. I was very fascinated by that. I mean, these are some you'll see interspersed projects from the students. So now, if we kind of pick up on those kinds of conditions where the relationship of scale, for instance, in architecture, or directionality in the way how we think about plans and sections, architectural componentry, finish, material, texture, color. If those kinds of conditions are much more in tune with the environment itself, what could that bring forth? So almost like every corner within Cappadocia, which is a relatively large region, but where we have this, the kind of rock formations that you usually see, these kinds of things, they're very close together. You don't have to drive like for hours to go from one to the other. You literally turn a corner and you have these ferry chimneys, for instance, which are basically forming already over here. Then over time, these pieces start to sort of separate, delaminate through cross erosion, and then the top part is harder than the bottom. So that's what's leading to this very kind of particular constellation. The top gets bigger and bigger because it can withstand the erosion. The sides start washing out, and finally the part on the top collapses. What's also really interesting about that is there's a cycle. There's a cycle of like building up, creating architecture, and then also destroying or destructing architecture. That is geological architecture. And it's happening over millions of years. And it's something that I think is very interesting, again, now a time where we have a very altered understanding of what the planet is, what planetary actions and agencies are, and how they come to fruition. And I think Alper was talking about this early on with his graph as well. We are doing architecture simultaneously to the earth, constantly creating matter, right? And to understand that we are not just on the surface building something on top of an already existing surface, but that we're working within something that's constantly, continuously designing and becoming, I think is a very important lesson to learn for a variety of reasons, environmental reasons, but also cultural and architectural reasons. So you can see these quote-unquote architectural studies, we like to call them artifacts with architectural qualities. So they're, I guess, proto-architectures. They have no particular program or function yet. Later on, they often do. But in the beginning, it's just sort of a very, again, immediate, visceral way of studying the site, taking photographs, looking at certain features and characteristics, and beginning to make quote-unquote design moves like shearing off certain elements, similar to the way how nature does it in a long period of time, but with a slight kind of twist to it. So when we look at a place like this, Chavushin is actually the old and the new. I think Ariane was talking about the vernacular, and I was thinking to myself, can we talk about a place like Cappadocia as a vernacular? It's a really interesting question, because it's really planetary, volcanic, millions of years old place, right? And yet, there's something vernacular about it. But vernacular also means regional, and kind of, to me, I always have an issue with the vernacular. Maybe we can debate that later. Anyway, but there's something here that I think this is not vernacular because it just isn't. And the thing on top, not really either, right? And yet they coexist and cohabitate in kind of strange ways. There's also architectural gems that were built into these rock formations, churches. So this place has been inhabited for thousands of years. It started with Hittite culture, probably even earlier on. And then Christians inhabited these rocks, and then later Turkic tribes coming into Anatolia and all the way until today. So there are layers of different type of architectural intervention on the rock, which I think is also really interesting. And aside from that, you also have architectural features that have arisen. It's not really clear at all why these things look the way they look, like in these examples. When you see the dark color on the rock formation, you know that fire has been burned. That's usually markers of ash, so it's often kitchen and so forth. But it's very hard to explain why some of these formations were shaped the way they were shaped. So in these kinds of speculative projects, we also don't always try to understand everything. We don't try to explain everything. We certainly don't try to analyze. We try to look, and perhaps that's also a nod on the notion of an aesthetic approach to architecture as, like I said, something that is sensible. And if it is sensible, perhaps we also have sensible ways of dealing with it. There's, of course, modern-day quarries that coexist within these landscapes where we just sort of industrialize the fashion of taking rock out of the mountain and turning it into some kind of architectural material. The residue of that is often very fascinating. To me, certainly not less interesting than architectural ornamentation in a more kind of classical sense. Why are we not dealing with these kinds of conditions more deliberately as architects? The things that we break leave something behind. They have leftovers, and I think those leftovers could be deployed in really interesting ways. It's not, again, like I said before, purely a thought of ecological or environmental value, but also aesthetic value and cultural value. There's a way how we carve in the mountain today. It's different. The traces are different than the way we did it 50 years ago, 100 years ago. Presumably into the future, these markings will be very different as well. And then in the vicinity, for instance, we have architecture like this from the Selçuk period, where you can literally see the different colorations of the mountain finding themselves in the architecture. And then the carving where, you know, sort of a kind of an ornament or a sort of a cultural expression that is layered over architecture transforms the rock into stone. But the rock is still alive, and you can see the very bright pieces are those that have been sort of added later on because older pieces were destructed or fell out. So you have this really beautiful mosaic, like a timeline, not unlike the strata that you see when you cut right next into the mountain in order to get a road through, and you can see all these layers that build up through geological time. But also the more trivial seemingly, or the pragmatic, there are these interesting refrigeration tunnels that are being cut into these mountains. So there is the kind of the habitation on top, there are the churches, there are like some cultural expressions in rock, and then underneath you have these cooling corridors for lemons and potatoes, and we were told that actually they work better than electrical refrigeration. So it's a very specific thermal quality, and it's done with this simple machine over here, and yet you also see these amazing, again, markings and traces. To me, that's a kind of an ornament that comes from sort of a relationship between the machine itself, obviously, the drill bit, and then just trying to be proficient, cut through the tunnel as fast as you can. And yet the effects, as you see, are really quite stunning. You have these ventilation shafts that just come through the top of the earth. So if you don't know, you walk around, you wonder what those are. You know that underneath you have all these strange refrigeration tunnels. So we played around with these kinds of ideas as well, again, where the top becomes basically the roof structure, but without you knowing, and there's just an implication through these individual pipes sticking out through the ground. Some play in these projects on just using exactly the same kind of technology, nothing from the outside, just that one robotic arm and riffing on its path and seeing what it can create. And then again, some kind of reference or affinity, unlikely affinities is the title of this talk today, These are actually, again, hundreds, if not thousands of years old. This is the underground city in Kaymaklı. There are like 3 very famous ones in the region. And you can see there's an affinity that sort of reaches way back into time and also into the future. And the tool is sort of carving and creating these different kinds of material effects. The rock churches, this one, the wall has been falling out and, oops, kind of revealing the interior. In its original state, it was entirely covered. So you have this interesting moment of reveal. Again, a play on that in one of these sort of artifacts, architectural artifacts. In some cases, you go into one of these openings, and inside you have this beautiful fresco with sort of, Byzantine churches. And it's also quite interesting how the color is being used, because the color comes from the ground. So back in the day, it wasn't really transported. So these are the kind of raw materials through which the frescoes were created. So convergence between the geology, cultural, tool impact, coloration, image, to bring all those together, not in a hierarchical way, but basically hybridize them in new types of forms and conditions is one of the interests in the studio. Very bizarre details that have emerged, fill-ins in order to stabilize the area from earthquakes, create these kinds of conditions on the left. Leftover pieces that, obviously at some point were complete, no longer are. But in that incompletion, I think there's an expression of time, the passage of time, which I think is also quite beautiful and should be something we consider as architects much more than we usually do. Even these kinds of examples where you see people just building on top of these existing rock formations, so the bottom parts are hundreds of years old, and then they're being reinforced with arches and other structural elements, and then on top, suddenly a relatively normative architecture, and yet, of course, not normative at all because of the way how it sits in the context and relates to it. So again, these are some plays, takes on these kinds of conditions. This is another example that I really like. It's a very, very, to me, odd and therefore interesting condition. The actual rock formation, openings and holes, and then the rock cut into masonry blocks, which then form a very different kind of facade. Windows do something quite different here than the windows up there. And then there's also the greenery that is sort of creeping up along, quote unquote, the facade of the building. So these are all incredibly, to me, fascinating moments that are not just interesting because they're historical or maybe accidental in the way they came about, but they hold some interest as research material that should be contemporary. Thank you.
Thank you for the reflections on the ideas that we have been trying to discuss. I think it was amazing to see how the idea could, the geospaces in your presentations in depth. So if there are questions, I think we still have 15 minutes to answer. Maybe so many questions that you can't bring up. You can't prioritize.
How are you using, in your presentation, you showed some examples of technology as informing your designs. So I'm curious how you're using technology, especially AI, when you're also thinking about natural structures. There seems to be this similarity in iteration of
Yes, definitely. I think what is we try to see what is happening in universe and in nature, being almost computational. So I think we are entering the age of AI. It kind of is being discussed as a version of industrial revolution, and everybody is curious about how we are going to feel about the singularity moment that we almost confuse if the machine is the human or not. So that I think is kind of being discussed through all the sci-fi and media in the news. But I think more interesting question is like where is the point that we are going to understand that everything is already computational and we are kind of part of this computational universe. So that's my understanding of the universe really, and we are not completely executing science or completely depicting the existing algorithms that is inside nature, but we are trying to kind of create an interface where we can relate. So that's the case for most of the projects we are trying to execute. Thank you for the question.
Just going to ask, because it was mentioned in a few of the presentations of architecture being sort of an iteration of nature. And I don't know, it's especially hard here where everything, like in Manhattan, where everything is fairly artificial and like I'm so planned. Like, what would you say your definition of nature is?
Great question. Do you have? Do I have an idea? I mean, I think it was very inspiring what we were showing what was underground New York in Michael's presentation. So I think in New York it is a collaboration rather than an iteration, a collaboration with nature. So like I was showing in one of the slides, everything is obviously built on the natural surface, and it still is affecting the existing situation. And when we are talking about nature, it wouldn't only consider the topography or the geology. It still is about winds, the urban ecology. I know Ariane is doing incredible work around that. So there are a lot of invisible layers of nature that still, I think, involves New York. But I don't have a term.
Maybe I could add to that. I think one of the things that happens, Alper, when you give us that planetary timeline is we have to ask sort of which period of nature when. And you know, you may be familiar with the term the Anthropocene, but this idea that we can actually sample the Earth's crust and find nuclear residue or carbon densities that indicate conditions that would never have occurred were it not for humans. And that becomes possibly not nature. Is it a techno-nature? Is it a anthropogenic nature? You know, is it something else in its, let's say, geological difference from what is before? So I think this question of architecture as an iteration of nature is interesting, but nature is also being iterated by multiple species, though you know humans have clearly had a much more potent effect.
That's a giving question. I think we can all kind of chime in a little bit. Maybe I just want to add one more thing to this. Nature is also, as far as I'm concerned, really a construct. And when we use the word nature, and you go back in time, and I think Michael touched on that in his presentation as well, particularly with the technological sublime, we go through different phases in which we project our ideas onto the thing we call nature, right? And lately, I would say, the later part of Enlightenment. But lately, we usually think of nature as some kind of scientific condition of matter that we can measure and weigh and sort of make analytical judgments upon. And that thing is nature. And I think what the Anthropocene has, at least to me, and I know to my colleagues here as well, shown that that's a very short-sighted view of understanding what nature is, right? It's not the other, but we're entirely sort of immersed in it and vice versa, which means that there is the kind of separation or the category where we say this is culture, this is technology, this is nature, upon which a lot of, again, Western thought has been built over very long periods of time. It's just no longer really making a lot of sense because there's much more sort of intertwinement that goes on, which is scary. And you showed that beautiful image of the new creatures taking sort of New Mexico's radiation ground and begin to grow in weird ways and glimmer and whatnot. It's scary, but it may also be a really interesting condition which we cannot turn back, right? I mean, the kind of synthetic nature we found ourselves. We can try to curb it to a certain degree, but it will have effects that are unprecedented. And maybe we also have to ask ourselves what we do with those effects.
I guess we'll all chime in on the question. I don't have an answer that I'm comfortable with, but what I do have is I think it's important to be constantly aware of the ways in which the world is made available to our senses and to sensing entities, and then how we make sense of those senses. And for me, in a nutshell, that's aesthetics. And it's quite often what has been used to do a lot of damage. Nature as a construct is initiated with an aesthetic construct of nature being the real that is that which is beyond our senses in a very Platonic manner. That sort of transcendent idea. If we kind of march through things that go through ones and twos and threes and fours and fives, if we go to twos, then nature is defined as the other, that which is the pair that is against us, and somehow there's one bubble that has humans and there's another bubble that has bunny rabbits and quasars and Saturn and dirt, and then that's a pretty big problem. And then we move into triads, things that move nature somehow as the world that's in between, the picturesque or the uncanny as something that is there between binaries. You have quads, think of Rosalind Krauss, landscape, not landscape, architecture, not architecture, and then finding like the missing term for these marked sites for another idea of the ways in which aesthetics can begin to work with the land. And then for me, iteration often works in 5 or more. 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 to infinity. And the iterative as a way in which we begin to notice minuscule differences that happen in seriality of paying attention, close attention to the world in ways that sometimes binaries or triads occlude from our senses. And it's a more difficult thing to make sense of, this world of close attention to minute differences that happen in the seriality of multiples. But I have hope in it, because if we can challenge the ways in which we sense the world to sense it in other ways than we can imagine, then we can maybe imagine other ways for us to build and to live in the world. And that doesn't define nature, I know, but nature is constantly in that sort of struggle as we begin to try to imagine the environments we create. There's a question in the back.
Yeah, thank you all for that. You mentioned invisible layers of nature. Considering the evolving natural landscape and really climate change, how do you envision present-day data resolution contributing to our
I think it's directed to me, if I'm understanding the question correctly. I think if we expand our sensorium beyond like visible light, and let's say, because in one way, a lot of the indicators that we've had about the climate emergency, the crises that we are dealing with, is being able to sense great subtle and slight variations that are interconnected over large expanses of the globe. And those are usually non-human sensors. They're a technological kind of sensing device. And it includes both things embedded and implanted within oceans and in terrains, but then also this sort of enlargement where we have puffed up our planet to include all these satellites that are orbiting around us and bouncing back information and surveilling us in all species, in all behaviors of all energetic spectrums. So how that remains to be seen. But again, if we can begin to sense things in manners that we usually, I mean, half the people were not really convinced of issues of climate change until they were aesthetically hit in the face with a polar bear on like a melting piece of ice and got scared for it. And that has an impact. And it's, I guess I want to be clear about this because it's not more data that will mobilize transformations and changes in our behavior, but it is the aggregated, integrated ways in which that data can be given and made sense of that allows us to see in a different manner. Now, I know I used a visual metaphor for something that is beyond vision. So if we are able to be attuned to spectrums outside of visible light, we're seeing thermal, we're seeing moisture, we're seeing other kinds of interactions between species that happen to do with things like solar radiation and photosynthesis and the other ways in which transformations of the environment are being off-gassed. That lets us see it in a different manner. And as architects, we work through representations. If we can see things differently, hopefully we can also begin to design and interact with that differently. Is that a partial? Yeah? Okay.
2 more minutes.
So I think we are at the end of our time here. Thank you for, again, making to the event and all the busy schedules. I also like to thank Vitra for always being with us, supporting our events and publication. And again, thank you guys for this deep, diverse conversation. I hope everything is recorded, so we like to we like to study those. Thank you all. Have a good night.